All right, day 2, reading The Power Broker. I'm in part 5, The Love of Power, chapter 26, Two Brothers. Today I got through pages 594 to 601. I'm a slow reader. I mean, these few pages basically go through the end of Paul's life and kind of the squalor that he ended up living in. There's a visceral imagery of the apartment that Robert Moses' brother, ends up dying in on like the 5th story of some Broadway, shack with these steep stairs that people say that it felt like 8 stories because the stairs were so steep. And there's this 80-year-old man having to climb them every day after having been trudging around Manhattan as a salesman, all because his brother, Robert Moses, wouldn't give him a job for which he would have been far more than adequately experienced for as an engineer. Robert Moses was largely at the helm of handing out so many of those engineering jobs, but didn't give one to his brother Paul. And his brother Paul was too stubborn to ask until the very end, apparently, when he was almost on his deathbed for fear of leaving his partner at the time in even worse poverty. I guess then that was the only impetus for him finally asking Robert Moses for a job. I mean, some of the takeaways from this concerning Robert Moses, his obsession with controlling the narrative and controlling the perception of truth. I mean, the fact that he wouldn't even tell anybody about his brother, about his family, all contributed to, his controlling of the narrative, which in and of itself was a form of power. I mean, he controlled the media at the time. One of the main lessons from early in the books, always side with the angels. I mean, Robert Moses was always an advocate for parks. I remember some passage where, in being for parks, he was an advocate for mothers with their children and strollers. Like, how could you fight against someone who is standing up for those people? And that's what Robert Moses would want you to think. And he leveraged that kind of moral high ground to enact what seemed to come to be, rather atrocious things, selfish things. One of them being to literally starve his own brother. I mean, Paul to an extent was stubborn in his own way, but for Robert Moses to have not even an inkling of compassion for his brother when he was in almost desperate poverty. I mean, he had holes in his shoes, he was jobless, he was suffering, in part because of his own stubbornness, but also because Robert Moses completely gutted Paul's ability to get jobs in the field that he was educated in, engineering, that he was brilliant in, because Robert Moses didn't want him around. And I guess to that point, that's a lesson to draw from Paul. I mean, his stubbornness also contributed to his poverty and suffering. His unwillingness to yield to his circumstances, as terrible as they were, being under the shadow of a brother who had disproportionate control over the framework of a city and over the doling out of jobs that might have been beneficial to Paul. Paul could have moved, Paul could have gone somewhere else, Paul could have taken charge of his life when he realized the circumstances of his current reality were not going to serve him, but his stubbornness contributed to his own decay. There's that phrase, I don't know exactly where it comes from, I think some poet, but those who life doesn't bend, it breaks. And it seems that that's pretty to the point regarding Paul. I mean, he was brilliant. He very likely, had he been willing to be a little bit more flexible, could have built himself a life somewhere else, out from under the shadow of Robert Moses. And then so much of what we see playing out in these two brothers, and what I appreciate about the way that Robert Caro has written this biography, starting from the genesis of this character, going back as far as his great-grandparents and then his grandmother, the domineering will that she passed along to her mother, Bella Moses, and how Bella Moses' traits got passed along to both Paul and Robert, and then this daughter, I think Edna, that I'm just now learning about, I feel like, but that Robert Moses didn't even talk about. But these traits of the mother, the stubbornness, the patronizing attitude, how that affected both Paul and Robert. Robert Caro even outlines that from the beginning, Paul did not bend to the will of his mother, whereas Robert did. And then you see those patterns play out even in the rest of their lives. Paul is not willing to compromise his ideals to the same extent that Robert was willing to compromise his ideals in order to get what he wanted. I mean, you see at the beginning of the book with Robert Moses that he had these beautiful ideals of how the city should be run, of how government should be run, good ideas that I think had they been put into effect without, so much resistance, they may well have been, effective, mostly with, creating efficiency in government with the way that people work. Cutting out inefficient people was a little bit ruthless, as Robert Moses has been known to be. But, there was a certain logic to it, but he got completely shot down. And so from that idealism of how things should work, when he went in and tried to do it and he realized that like this was not like striking a chord with anybody and he was not getting anywhere, he pivoted, he changed, he adapted to his environment to then get to a point where he was controlling the environment. But Paul Moses never engaged in that way, and even starting with the way he was with his mother, he pushed back. I think there's some passage here where he ended up, dating some girl at Princeton who his mother absolutely did not approve of, who, according to Robert Caro, is likely who he did end up with later in his life, and is the woman that he ended up finally ceding a little bit of his pride for by asking Robert Moses for a job finally when he was 75, because he was afraid that he was going to leave his partner in squalor. I guess the last kind of thing that this few pages kind of makes me think of, and it's like the whole book, is, Robert Moses obviously was, it's too simple to say evil, but he was a ruthless force. He did a lot of harm, but he accumulated a lot of power. And what does it say about the framework that was already in place before someone like him came along, that a person engaging in that way is able to come to power? Like, what does it say that like ruthlessness is rewarded in the framework of the society that we live in? Maybe that's a very broad statement, but it doesn't feel like such a reach. Even the way that Robert Moses treats people as things to be used, right? To be used and then discarded. It's not that I know the story of every other successful person to come to some conclusion that it's like ruthlessness and, heartlessness are what enable a person to, ascend to positions of power. But certainly it feels like the ascent of Robert Moses is a testament to that sort of like underlying reality. He did come to control a lot of the infrastructure of how things got done, but he had to change to adhere to the framework that existed long before him. So I think even that maybe kind of expands out into, a greater theme. Even like capitalism, like people who, criticize a Jeff Bezos, people who have kind of won the game as it is, and maybe this is an idea that deserves some pushback, but it's like, these people, just like all of us, came into a system that existed before them, have to some extent play by the rules of that system, and they're ascending to, the pinnacles of power, are essentially of their capacity to win the game as it is. I think there's something to be said that, like if you can get to the top, once you get to the top, it should be a moral responsibility to, if you have the power, to affect the framework of the rules, to attempt to do so. But then that almost feels like a weird catch-22, because maybe you put yourself in a vulnerable position and are more likely to lose that power in the attempt to change the framework. But maybe those are the kinds of like noble sacrifices that are necessary in order to kind of reform some of the downsides of what an infrastructure of society that rewards ruthlessness can cause, I guess. Not as distilled of a thought here, but something that kind of comes up again and again when I keep reading this book. Like, Robert Moses, I think, becomes kind of a villain, and the seeds are within him to be a villain, like starting from his mother, just this stubbornness, this selfishness, this patronizing attitude, this attitude towards people that they are objects to be used. That was all latent in him, but those traits, were the elements of his character that, among other things, did contribute to his ability to rise the ranks and accumulate power. And then finally, kind of just to bring it back full circle, especially regarding these few pages, the fact that he never talked about his family, that he, suffocated the world from the reality of his upbringing for a long time. And it's only because of like the digging that Robert Caro was able to do that we're even like seeing this. He controlled the narrative, he controlled the truth, and, controlling the flow of information is a form of power. And Robert Moses, did so starting even with himself, with the family. I feel like I've read at some point that, he was born into a Jewish family, but he absolutely hid this fact. He didn't want people associating him with kind of Jewishness or being a Jew. And again, him wanting to control his narrative and control the narrative, because that's, a very potent form of power. So, as always with all of this Robert Caro, there's a lot to think about and unpack, and hopefully lessons to be drawn. One from Robert Moses, but two from, Paul Moses, this tragic character. And again, I'm just kind of coming to the conclusion of be careful with pride, be careful with stubbornness. It can definitely be an asset, but can also serve to be a detriment if you are too, unyielding in a world that can break you. I mean, if you're trying to fight the ocean, unless you've, built a great boat, you're probably going to drown. And I think that what we see in Paul Moses is a man who drowned because of a lot of his own flaws, and because he was up against a force that was too overwhelming in the form of his own brother, Robert Moses. So we'll leave it with that. I'll catch you guys on the next page.